Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Muxus Goblin Grandee as a Goblin Tribal Commander deck. So typically the traditional Goblin Tribal Commander has been Krenko, the one that taps and makes Goblin tokens, and that one is more set up to create vast swaths of Goblins that overrun the board or just straight up combo. But for this version we're looking at Muxus. So what does Muxus do? It is a 6 mana 4/4, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 6 cards of your library, put all goblin creatures with mana value 5 or less from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. And whenever it attacks, it gets +1 until end of turn for each other goblin you control. So the main plan here is going to be, we want to fill our deck full of goblins, we want to have a bunch of fast mana and ramp, we want to ramp out into Muxus, and then we want to go hit a bunch of goblins for free off the top, potentially comboing as well. So we're a mono red deck, which means we are constricted on what we can do. So we've got Jeska's Will, Skull Clamp, One Ring, Throne of Eldraine, War Room, and Wheel of Fortune as our card draw. Skip combo for now. Some counters in the Red Blasts and Tybalt's Trickery. We've got a bunch of fast mana, So the typical ones like Lotus Petal, Jeweled Lotus, Simian Spirit Guide, but then Rite of Flame, but then we've also got Seething Song, Blank Goblin, Reckless Barbarian, Vessel of Volatility, Treasonous Ogre, Desperate and Pyretic Ritual, and Battle Hymn and Brightstone Ritual, which add red equal to the number of goblins in the case of Brightstone Ritual, or just all creatures in the case of Battle Hymn. Then we've got our goblins, which again we're going to skip over for right now. Some things that grant haste, Generator Servant and Torch Courier, which are relevant for combos we'll get to later. A bunch of lands, mostly mountains with some other lands thrown in here. Sanctum of Eternity, tap, return target commander you own from the battlefield to your hand. So this is a way that we can bounce Muxus and replay it immediately, depending on if we can generate enough mana to do that, which we can with a lot of rituals. Defense Grid, Deflecting Swat and Cavern as protection, a bunch of ramp spells, including Professional Facebreaker and Ruby Medallion. Then we've got Goblin Trash Master, which is really great since we're generating a bunch of goblins anyway. We may as well play this card that allows us to blow up artifacts for basically free. We've got the 2 Blood Moon effects, Trinisphere and Godpharaoh's Statue as some stacks effects. And then our tutors, which include Goblin Recruiter, Imperial Recruiter, Mog Catcher, Goblin Matron, and then Molten Echoes, which is a 4 mana enchantment that says, you choose a creature type, and whenever a non-token creature of the chosen type enters the battlefield, so whenever a goblin enters the battlefield, you create a token that's a copy of the creature, it gains haste, and you exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So let's get back to our goblins. So a bunch of these goblins are also going to be related to combos, so we'll just go over all of these really quickly, and then we'll get to the combos. So Conspicuous Snoop, play with the top card revealed, you may cast goblins off the top, and it has all activated abilities of goblins on the top. Dockside Extortionist, of course. Goblin Chieftain, haste, other goblins get +1 in haste. Goblin Lackey, whenever it deals combat damage or deals damage to a player, you may put a goblin permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is a way just to cheat out some of our more expensive goblins. Goblin Matron, tutors for the goblin. Goblin Recruiter is when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for any number of goblin cards, you reveal them, and then you shuffle and put the cards on top in any order. So it tutors any number of goblins, but specifically it puts them on top, not in your hand. Trash Master, we've already been over that. Goblin War Chief, goblins cost 1 less and have haste. Grenzo Havoc Raiser, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, choose 1. Goad target creature the player controls, don't care about that. Exile the top card of that player's library until end of turn. You may cast that card, you may spend mana or mana of any color to cast that spell. Do care about that. Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, other goblins get +1, and it has red tap, deal damage equal to the number of goblins that entered the battlefield under your control this turn to any target. Kiki Jiki, don't really think I need to say more about this card. Krenko Mob Boss, this is the card that is usually the Goblin Commander. Tap, create X 1/1 goblins, where X is the number of goblins you control. So Krenko is always paired up with like effects that untap him and give him haste so that you can just spew out a bunch of goblins immediately. And it is very possible that you could just swap these around. So you could just make Krenko the commander and Muxus just another card in the deck. It really depends on what you want to do. Mog Fanatic, sack to deal 1. This is part of a combo. We'll get to that. Pashalik Mons, whenever Pashalik or another goblin you control dies, Pashalik Mons deals 1 damage to any target, and it has 4 sack a goblin, create 2 1/1 goblins. Runevelt Hordemaster, other goblins get +1, and whenever itself or another goblin you control dies, exile the top card of your library. If it's a goblin creature card, you may cast the card until end of turn. Skirk Prospector, sack a goblin to generate red. Torch Courier for haste, Warren Instigator. This is just a 2 mana version of Goblin Lackey, although it also has double strike. And then of course the Blank Goblin, which technically is not infinite because you run out of stickers, I believe, at a certain point, right? I forget exactly how stickers work. Regardless, you're basically going to use this as a Goblin Seething Song most of the time. So let's move on to the combos. So the combo cards over here that we haven't touched on so far are Breath of Fury, Cloudstone Curio, Energy Refractor, Mana Echoes, Panharmonicon, and Shared Animosity. So Cloudstone Curio, this one's pretty obvious. It goes infinite with Dockside, depending on how many artifacts or enchantments your opponents have. So Dockside plus just a goblin that costs 1. If you have opponents control a total of 4 artifacts or enchantments, you make infinite treasures. Or you can just go off in other ways, like if you have Molten Echoes to generate mana, then that also combos with Cloudstone Curio. Breath of Fury is when enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, you sacrifice it and attach Breath of Fury to a creature you control. If you do, untap all creatures you control, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So if you have anything that is making additional tokens, you can always just keep moving Breath of Fury onto those tokens, such as, let's say, Krenko Mob Boss or Kiki Jiki, and you just keep attacking your opponents over and over and over. Even if you don't have a technically infinite combo with Breath of Fury, you may just have so many goblins to begin with that you can just kill your opponents regardless. Shared Animosity, also technically not infinite, but all of your creatures are goblins. You're making bunches of goblins. You're making bunches of goblin tokens. You're going to be able to attack for a lot of damage. And then Kiki Jiki is shockingly missing an untap effect, but Kiki Jiki goes infinite with Snoop. So anyone familiar with goblins in Modern or even Legacy in a lot of cases will be familiar with this combo. If you have Snoop and you have Kiki Jiki on top of your library, Snoop has all activated abilities of Kiki Jiki, meaning Snoop can target itself to copy itself. The new Snoop token comes in, the Snoop token can copy itself or the original Snoop, and you make infinite Snoops. And at that point, you can win in certain ways. Now, the issue is that the Snoops are tapped, so you can't actually attack with them all, like you could with a normal untapper with Kiki Jiki. But if you have, say, Pashalik Mons, all you have to do is go to your end step, then all of the tokens die to the delayed sack trigger, and then Pashalik Mons triggers infinitely, dealing infinite damage. You also have Mog Fanatic, so if you can get Mog Fanatic on top of your deck, you can then make infinite tokens, and then Snoop has the activated ability of Mog Fanatic, as do all of the token copies of Snoop. You can then sack them all to deal infinite damage. And that is where Goblin Recruiter comes in. So Goblin Recruiter can go tutor up all of these combo pieces. It can also put Kiki Jiki and Mog Fanatic directly on top of your deck. So let's say you've got Snoop in play. You then go Goblin Recruiter, put Kiki Jiki on top and Mog Fanatic directly under it. You make infinite tokens with the Snoop. And then as long as you have a way to draw a card in any way, or rearrange the top of your library, you get Kiki Jiki, you either draw it or you just cast it with the Snoop if you have enough mana, or you just find a way to rearrange the top of your library with like a Sensei's Divining Top or something. Now Mog Fanatic's on top of your deck, you deal infinite damage with Snoop. Or you can use Recruiter to set up other combos, like you can go find Pashalik, etc. Torch Courier is also important for giving Snoop haste. So you could find like Recruiter, and then you just find all of these goblins and then potentially like draw multiple of them, and then you go like Snoop, Torch Courier, give Snoop haste, activate with Kiki Jiki on top, make infinite tokens, etc. Of course, Mana Echoes will give you a bunch of mana off of all of that already, and there are other ones to do. So one of the other things that you might want to do is, so things like Mana Echoes generate a ton of mana, but they only generate mana in colorless. So Energy Refractor can then switch that colorless to red, which means that you can then have infinite red mana as well. Panharmonicon also is good with any sort of ETB triggers that you have in your deck, including Muxus. So you get double Muxus triggers. That's going to be really good, of course. Also, if you can produce a sufficient amount of colorless mana using Echoes, you can then have Pashalik Mon's ability to sack goblins to generate more goblins, also generate mana off of the Mana Echoes. So if you have a sufficient amount of either mana to start with or goblins to start with, you can use Pashalik Mons to generate more and more mana and more tokens, also triggering it each time you sack the tokens. And if you have Energy Refractor, you can just straight up convert all the colorless into red, or at least some of the colorless into red, to then keep going infinite with Pashalik Mons. So Pashalik plus Mana Echoes, given a sufficient amount of mana or starting goblins, can be damage equal to however much red mana you have, and with the sufficient amount with Energy Refractor added in is then infinite. Or If you have Cloudstone Curio, you can also just bounce creatures back and forth and also make a ton of mana off of Mana Echoes that way. Similarly, Breath of Fury sacks the creature that it's attached to, which will also trigger Pashalik Mons. You can also just sack any goblins that you need into Goblin Trashmaster or into Skirk Prospector. So the Skirk Prospector can also transform the goblin tokens that you're making into red mana to keep going. So the Skirk Prospector will also convert colorless mana from echoes into red mana. Or rather, it will convert goblins into red mana, which you can then use to pay for costs like these. And there are other ways to combo off using various combinations of these cards and or goblins that are not shown here, but that would just be adding more and more cards onto it. You could add them if you wanted to, but you don't have to. Like, you don't need Energy Refractor. There's other cards that convert, but Energy Refractor is probably the best one because it draws a card, whereas all the other ones are basically all creatures that convert without drawing cards, and none of them are goblins. Now, as I said, Krenko is often the preferred commander in this deck because it allows you to just spew out tons of tokens, in which case you always want to be playing more cards that give haste and cards that untap Krenko, so like Thousand Year Elixir, Lightning Greaves, etc. But that's one version of the deck. Muxus is the other version. So Krenko is more combo oriented in the sense that there are combos that you can do with just Krenko, whereas Muxus doesn't specifically have any combos with just Muxus other than maybe bouncing it back to your hand and replaying it to get all the goblins out of your deck with like Cloudstone Curio or something. It's also less expensive by 2 than Muxus is, but it also gives you less immediate value. You need haste in order to activate it immediately. You need a sufficient number of goblins in order to activate it immediately. If you're just tapping it and you're making 1 or 2 goblin tokens, that's not very good. Whereas Muxus, just triggering and putting the goblins off the top 6 cards, depending on how many goblins you hit, is very good. And this deck has a total of 19 goblins, which might not be enough, so you may want to increase the total goblin count in the deck. But other than that, I think I personally prefer Muxus, but you could really go either way with either Muxus or Krenko. So anyway, that is Muxus Goblin Grandee, or more accurately, Goblin Tribal in EDH.